The first set of muscles that we'll be exploring will be those that control action of our shoulders as well as our back. The first of which is our trapezius. We've seen this before. The trapezius has several functions. There are 3 components to it. We saw earlier in the video 1 that the superior portion of the trapezius is involved in flexion and extension of the neck. We'll be focusing our attention here on the ones that are directly acting on our shoulder. When the trapezius is isolated, we get a clear picture as to its attachment sites. So its origin is all along the spinous process of our vertebrae, and its insertion is along the acromion process as well as the scapular spine. When the arm is extended in front, it causes a retraction of the shoulder. It pulls the shoulder back. In its anatomical position, it will elevate the shoulder when pulled. The inferior portion of the trapezius depresses the shoulder when activated. Removing the trapezius as well as the splenius capitis will expose the levator scapulae muscle. Its origin is on the transverse process of the cervical vertebrae, and its insertion is along the medial side of the scapula. Its action is in elevating the shoulder. The last muscle that we will explore acting on the shoulder is called the Pectoralis Minor. Now this one is somewhat deep, and so I had to remove the Pectoralis Major here. We'll explore that in a little bit. Its origin is along these 3 ribs here. Its insertion is on the coracoid process of the scapula. Its action is in protraction of the shoulder. So when your arm is extended forward, it will pull your hand forward or your arm forward. Its other action is in the depression of the shoulder. Very similar to our trapezius, it'll depress the shoulder. Continuing our dissection of the muscles, we'll be able to see this next one called the Longissimus thoracis. We can see it's quite a deep muscle, and it runs the entire length of our back. Its origin is in the spinous process of the lumbar. So this is going to be the fixed site as well as the sacrum. And its insertion is along the ribs as well as the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. It has 2 actions. Its first action is the extension and hyperextension of spine. Its second action is in the flexion of the spine, a lateral flexion of the spine. The next group of muscles will be those involved in the flexion, extension, and rotation of the arm. The first muscle that we'll be looking at is the deltoid muscle. That's this muscle here, which forms the bulk part of our shoulder. Its origin is along the clavicle, the acromion process of the scapula, as well as the scapular spine, and its insertion is on that deltoid tuberosity on our humerus. Its primary action is in the abduction of our arm, or drawing our arm away from our body toward the side. It'll also be involved in lifting your arm or flexing your arm forward as when you are swinging your arms while walking. The next muscle to look at is our Latissimus Dorsi here. And this is a fairly large triangular shaped muscle on the mid to lower portion of our back. Its origin is on the spinous process of our thoracic as well as our lumbar vertebrae and sacrum. And its insertion is just inferior to our lesser tubercle of the humerus on the anterior side. It is a powerful arm extension as well as hyperextender of the arm. It's also an adductor of our arm as well. So it's an antagonist of our deltoid muscle. It's involved in the medial rotation of our arm. So this muscle is highly engaged during a lot of sporting actions, such as a downward swing while playing tennis or a stroke as you are swimming. The Pectoralis Major has its origin on the clavicle here as well as along the sternum, and its insertion is just below the greater tubercle of our humerus, so right along this crest line here. Its major action is in the adduction of the arm. So as the arm is elevated and pulled away from the body, it will bring the arm back into the body. The Pectoralis Major will also be involved in shoulder flexion or flexion of the arm. Now deep to the deltoid muscle and trapezius, we have the infraspinatus muscle. Here we can see the infraspinatus muscle a little bit more clearly, and its origin is along the scapular spine as well as the medial side of the scapula, and its insertion is along the greater tubercle of our humerus. Its action is in the lateral rotation of the arm. In addition, it will help to stabilize many of the actions of the shoulder. Just below the infraspinatus muscle, we have what's known as the Teres Major. The origin of the Teres Major is along the inferior portion of our scapula, and its insertion is just below the lesser tubercle of our humerus, so along that crest here. Its primary action is in the medial rotation of the entire arm at the shoulder. The next muscle of the arm, and probably one of the most known muscles of the arm, is our Biceps Brachii. Now it actually has two heads, so that's why it's called a biceps muscle. It's interestingly, none of its attachment sites are actually on our humerus at all. Its origins are on the glenoid cavity here of our scapula, as well as the coracoid process of the scapula. And its insertion is on the radial tuberosity of our radius. Working with other muscles, it'll be involved in the flexion of the arm at the shoulder, as well as flexion of the arm at the elbow. So it's going to pull the forearm in toward the upper arm. One of its major functions is in the supination of the forearm. Now the real powerful muscle of the upper arm is the brachialis. Now this is the one doing most of the work. However, it's not seen as much because it's hidden underneath our biceps brachii. So here we can see that it has its origin in the midsection of our humerus, and its insertion is on the ulna. So because the ulna doesn't really rotate a whole lot, this will make for a much more powerful pull or a flexion of the arm. A synergist to the brachialis is the brachioradialis. Its belly can be seen on the lateral portion of our forearm. Its origin is on the inferior and lateral end of our humerus. Its insertion is along the styloid process of our radius. Its action is in elbow flexion. Now for every action, we need to have an opposing action here. So our major extender of the arm, a very powerful extender of our arm, is our Triceps Brachii. Tricep indicates that it has three origins. One of its origin is just below the glenoid cavity of our scapula. Another origin is along that greater tubercle crest here in the posterior end side of our humerus. And the other origin is on the medial side below the head of our humerus. Its insertion is on the olecranon process of our ulna. So the action is in extension of that flexed arm. So it's going to bring our arm back to a straightened position. The last muscle that we'll look at acting on our arm is our Pronator Teres. Now this muscle will attach to the medial epicondyle of our humerus, and it will insert almost midway down the radius, and just as its name suggests, its action is going to be in the pronation of the forearm. So it's going to be an antagonist of the Biceps Brachii. Remember, the Biceps Brachii acts to supinate or turn the hand out so the palms are facing forward, whereas the Pronator Teres is going to turn the forearm in to draw the palm toward the back of your body. That we'll be exploring are those that are involved in acting on the hand and wrist. All of these muscles can be found on the forearm. The muscles of the anterior side will all be involved in flexion, and those here on the posterior side will all be involved in extension. We'll begin by looking at the muscles of the anterior side involved in flexion. We'll start by looking on the medial side, and then we'll work our way out laterally. So the first muscle, the most medial muscle that we'll explore, is the one known as the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. So this is the one that's going to be involved in flexion, and it's located on the ulnar side. Its origin is on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion is on the lateral carpals of our wrist. Its other action is in an adduction of the wrist. So it's going to draw your hand in toward your body. The next muscle is the Palmaris Longus. This muscle also has its origin in the medial epicondyle, and its insertion is on the tendons of the palmar. It's involved in a hand flexion, so it'll cause your hand to bend toward your arm. So it'll be a flexion at your wrist joint. The next muscle of the forearm is called the Flexor Carpi Radialis muscle. Its origin is also on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. However, now its insertion is on the side of the carpals and metacarpals just below the radius. It too will have a flexion of the hand at the wrist joint. It will oppose the action of the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. It will cause an abduction of the hand. So it's going to draw your palm away from your body. And the last muscle of the anterior forearm is one that's just a bit deeper. This one's known as the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. The origin of the Flexor Digitorum is on the coronoid process of the ulna. Its insertion is on the tendons of the phalanges 2 through 5. So as you can see here, it's going to cause flexion of our fingers. Moving on to the posterior muscles. Again, starting with the medial side, we'll begin with the Extensor Carpi Ulnaris muscle. Now this muscle will have an origin on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Its insertion is along the medial metacarpal. Its action is involved in the extension of the hand. Now, just like the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, it will also be involved in adduction of the hand. So it's going to bring the hand toward the body. So the body would sit right in this position here, and it will draw the hand toward the body. We have our Extensor Digitorum muscle, and this muscle has its origin again on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and it inserts into the tendons of our digits on the back of the hand. Its action is in the extension of the fingers. The last of our muscles in this group is our Extensor Carpi Radialis. The Extensor Carpi Radialis are actually composed of two separate muscles. We have a longer one and we have a shorter one here. Essentially, their attachment sites, however, are relatively in the same position. Again, that origin is along that lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion is along the lateral metacarpals and carpals. And its job is to extend the hand back into a straightened position. It will work along with the Flexor Carpi Radialis to abduct the arm or draw the hand away at the wrist.